Thank you.
Tak, Venka.
And if you didn't realize from the title, I speak English, but I understand Danish perfectly. So you're welcome to ask questions and we can discuss in Danish or in Denglish if you want. But you're an inclusion professional, so I hope you won't take me for bad if I'm not able to speak Danish. But thank you, Dorte, for this invitation. And it's my pleasure to be here, an honor to be here today in this dialogue conference. And I do hope that the language will not be a barrier for our stimulating discussions, both at the end of this session, because I decided with myself I will stick to the 25 minutes we were asked to stick to, although I'm sure we all do our best. Let's see. But the dialogue we can have at the end of this talk and also at the end of the conference in the panel session. Although I'm not directly a PPR researcher, a little disclaimer, as Jens Christian also did, I think my research is relevant for PPR practice because, as the title of my professorship says, I do research in school development, in well-being and learning. And I think you are very closely, your practice is very closely connected to all these areas. But my research specifically is situated within the paradigm of health promoting schools or well-being promoting schools, which was initiated by the WHO, the World Health Organization, in the 90s, end of the 80s, 90s. And Denmark has been part of this so-called European network of health promoting schools since '92, and very influential part of the network in research domains, but not so much, I dare say, in the practice. This paradigm, this initiative defines school as a place that constantly has a focus to develop children's capacities for learning, living, and playing. As you can see already, we have here Bronfenbrenner, like the socio-ecological theory embedded in this initiative. And although Jens Christian said, Jens Erik said that this movement has been a part of the neoliberal developments, I would argue opposite. And you will notice some contradictions, maybe, which can stimulate our dialogue and discussion. Because the initiative has been, the main point of this initiative has been to shift the focus in health, in the health sector, in the medical sector, from the individual to the social determinants and societal determinants of health and well-being. To consider the wider contextual factors that co-create health and well-being. And the reason for this was to avoid the so-called healthism, or blaming the victim for their problems. So instead of blaming the individuals for having both health or well-being problems, to look at the wider social, societal, socioeconomic factors that cause these problems. So the rationale was better justice, avoidance of stigmatization and marginalization. And of course, Jens Erik's argument still stands. There are some savings, economic savings embedded in the initiative because, of course, it's cheaper to prevent than to cure. So there are nuances in the paradigm and in our takes on this. And the reason why I think this research could be relevant for you, you will tell me later, I hope, is that in your practice, to my knowledge, you also navigate between these dualities, between the individual and between the collective, concern for the individual student well-being and concern for the classroom or for the school. You also navigate between the education sector and the health sector, mental health sector. You navigate between looking at children with problems or deficits or diagnosis and looking at the whole child. So there are some overlaps between your practices and this research or this paradigm or the practice of health or well-being promoting schools. And in the initiative, all over Europe, and this is a global initiative, there are networks all over the world nowadays, although it started in Europe, school psychologists and mental health services surrounding the schools, as it is in Denmark, in municipalities, have been a very active part in the practice of health promotion in schools. Not so much in Denmark. Moreover, why I think this is also relevant, this research is relevant for you, is that the overview of historical developments of PPR that our colleague and PhD student Christopher Boren made, and I had the pleasure to listen to recently, shows that it was between the 70s and 80s here in Denmark that a shift was made in the PPR practice from fixing the child to fixing the school. So here we are. Both in these initiatives 30 years later and in your practice 50 years since this paradigm shift, we are still here today at this conference discussing the same shift from the individual child to prevention to health promotion. So I think there is still work to be done. The publications that you can see here on the slide are the main literature I used to prepare this talk. One is the international anthology of articles, international papers from all over the world within this paradigm. And the one on the right, it's in Danish. It presents the model of well-being that I will be talking about today, which I developed and published together with Dorte Koschholt. But to start with the story. To start with the plan for today, it will be a very simple talk, two main concepts. One is what does it mean to move upstream, and the other is the concept of well-being. And I hope that we can have a discussion. My intention is to stimulate, inspire, and challenge you to rethink and maybe to add, modify your practice. And then the story. Once upon a time, the story goes, there were two people sitting by the river. All of a sudden, they notice a child falling down the river, and one of the adults jumps into the river, grabs the child, and brings her to safety. As soon as they are safe, they notice another child falling down the river, and same adult jumps again, grabs the child, and brings them to safety. Before they can catch their breath, another child is in trouble. Now the other adult jumps in, saves the child, and the process repeats as more children fall into the river, causing the adults to become exhausted and increasingly afraid that it would be impossible to save all the children. At some point, they decide to move upstream. What does it mean? They build a net and try to catch as many children as possible before they get into serious trouble. But that helps a little bit, but not enough. It's not enough. So what do? They go further upstream and they try to explore why on earth children are falling into the river in the first place. Does this resonate with some of your practice? Yeah? You're jumping in the river and you're exhausted and you don't have time and you don't have resources and it's not enough. So simply prevention and health promotion. Let's see. Working down the stream would be your work it's a simplified story. There is much more complexity, I'm aware of that. But that would correspond with your work, working with children with problems. Then moving to prevention would be early identification of the problems, intervening as early as possible, detection, and so on and so forth. And promotion, health promotion or well-being promotion that I will be talking about more would be to actually look at the whole school environment. And as Pernille also said in the previous talk, to look at all the arenas surrounding the child and identify the problems. So this is this movement. I mean, it's not a linear movement. It's not a one-way movement. And of course, it's not a paradigm shift, and you shouldn't forget all that you normally do and just jump from treating or assessing and diagnosing individual children to working with the school buildings. But there is a back and forth kind of, it's to add and not to add more responsibilities on your shoulders. I know you have enough, but to add a little bit difference in the thinking about the children, the well-being of the children that you work with. So from assessment to assisting children diagnosed with any learning or psychosocial difficulties, preventing mental illness through early detection, and then the last 3 points are the points that I will be focusing on to proactively do things in your professional practice which enhance well-being in the everyday life of the whole school environment for all the children, but that would be sensitive also to children with difficulties. And that sometimes involves your consultancy and support for teachers and school leaders, which I'm sure you already are doing. So my argument is that in order to include this in your practices, we need to rethink the whole concept of well-being, if you want. I don't know, and here on this slide, you have some words in Danish and English that we typically use in this area, and they are different. And take a moment and reflect a little bit about which ones do you use. When, I mean, trivsel in Danish only recently came into agenda, in the educational agenda with the reform from 2014, when it was one of the pillars of the educational reform. But before that, there were other kind of words, other terms at place. So which ones do you use in your disciplinary background or in your professional practice? And how do you define them? You don't have to answer. I'm going to ask you questions as I go along. No answer is immediately needed, but I hope we can take your reflections at the end. So which ones do you use? How do you define all the words that you use? And how are they similar or different from other professionals that you collaborate with? Teachers, school leaders, pedagogues, psychologists, psychiatrists. We would all have, and what is tragic sometimes is that we use the words without defining them, without specifying and without operationalizing them. And therefore the whole field of practice as well as research is very muddy, it's very fluid. Therefore, well-being, therefore, is a so-called, in research it's called floating signifier. What does it mean? It means that it's open to interpretation, and it's normally, its interpretation depends on other concepts which are also floating. For example, in the school context, this would be adaptation to school, learning, success, or school fear, or school avoidance, or anxiety, stress, you name it. So to define trivsel, well-being of children would be to connect with some of these other elements. And well-being is also a mobile phenomenon. It travels over space and time, as Jens Erik beautifully presented, and sometimes it signifies societal issues, such as welfare, for example. And initially kind of the whole health promotion and prevention movement could, as he pointed out, to this neoliberal kind of economic saving aspects, but then it was also about social welfare. It is also about social justice and equality in health. But then it moves also to the inner world of each of us individually. So again, when we talk about well-being, more often than not, it's not very clear, and these words are often used as synonyms, but they are not. If we dig a little bit deeper, they are really not synonyms. And the last kind of linguistic comment that I will say about well-being is that it's a noun, and I think it's the same in Danish. It's not a verb, it's a noun. What does it mean? It means that the active kind of element is taken out. It's static. It's a static kind of position rather than, if it was a verb in English, it would be being well or becoming a well person. And this is like more static. So all this kind of has a meaning when we work with well-being and when we talk and do research. As a result, the landscape is very complex. And there are a lot of actors at place and a lot of interests, as also Jens Erik said. How do parents define, and parents from different cultures? How do children, what does well-being means to them? How different professionals they all have, and how do we navigate this complex and I would say contested area? Contested means that there are struggles, like we all want to impose our own perspective over. Psychiatrists want the biomedical model, I assume. Psychologists want the subjective well-being individual model. Educationalists want, so it's an area of a lot of struggle around for definitions. Historically, and this is nothing new, it goes back to the antiquity. And historically, the ancient Greek philosophers, Epicurus and Aristotle, have defined, have talked about well-being in different way, like, and all the theoretical and practical initiatives working with well-being nowadays could be placed on this continuum, you can say, between defining well-being as a pleasure over pain, or inspired by Epicurus, or becoming the true self, eudaimonic, like hedonic and eudaimonic. Eudaimonic, daimon means the true self. So becoming the true self, or living a life of meaning, purpose, and virtue. This was what Aristotle would say, but all this, I have just put here some of the most dominant kind of takes on well-being nowadays. You can place them, and this is how I place them, like the yellows are more towards pleasure over pain, and the whites are more towards eudaimonic. And you can place your definitions and your approaches that you work with, the interventions that you take on this continuum. And it's not black and white, and it's a continuum, and there are overlaps. But it's an interesting, it's not the point to categorize the approach. The point is to reflect and to use it as an analytical strategy to when you reflect up, and analyze your practice. So I argue, together with, of course, other colleagues in the field, that there are certain areas around this conceptual thinking on well-being that need to be troubled, need to be destabilized, that we often take for granted in our research, in our talking, in our practice. And these are some of these areas. I'm not going to go through all of them. I know that you know them. And when we talk about well-being, of course we think that emotion and cognition are not separated, they're together. Of course we think that positive and negative emotions go together. But specifically when we think about well-being in schools, and when you think about how schools are organized, how the school everyday life looks like, focused on academic achievement and focused on learning, these areas or these ways of thinking about well-being are taken for granted, and we need to to kind of shake them up a little bit. The last two are specifically interesting and specific to schools, and I will come back to that point a little bit later. And like socialization over subjectification, I will explain what that means, and then treating well-being as a state of being rather than as a process of becoming, as I mentioned already before. So in my work, and together with Dorte and other colleagues, I'm trying to develop the way of thinking and working and practical directions for working with well-being in schools, not in general, but in schools, by integrating three theories. And not to worry, I'm not gonna talk long and wide about all these theories, just to give you a glimpse that the way, even if you're psychologists, or if you're pedagogues, or if you're educationalists, or school leaders, the way, and you have your disciplinary background, the way we think, I dare say, should think about well-being is to expand the disciplinary boundaries and to think in a more multidisciplinary way. The first kind of theoretical perspective is the socio-ecological model. And thank you, Pernille, you already explained that. I mean, this is not Bronfenbrenner, but it's within this paradigm of health promotion. Defines mental health and well-being as created in places where people live, love, learn, work, and play. So the whole kind of ecologies of being. So the consequence for that, when we think well-being, is to expand our focus and think not only about the individual, but further. In the school context specifically, this means that well-being is co-created. It's not something children bring with them from home in the school. It's co-created within the dynamics of the schools. And there are different dynamics there which are confirmed in research that they kind of influence or have impact on well-being, such as the physical environment, like, you know, the aesthetics, but also the ergonomics, the links with the family and the community, the school culture, the social order of the school, the leadership, the curriculum, and so on and so forth. And PPR also is there somewhere. You do, with your practices, you do co-create the phenomenon of children's well-being. So the question is where your work fits, and how, or is it at all possible that your work would spread to other dimensions or dynamics of the school than the ones that you normally work with. The second theory is the neurocognitive theory, and specific part of it called 4E approaches. And Dorte and I couldn't, when we wrote the article in Danish, we couldn't translate these notions of embodied, that well-being is embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended. So we have tried, I have also put here the explanations in Danish, but basically the kind of the main point there is that the mental functions, all the mental functions of all of us, children and adults, cannot be fully understood without the reference to the physical body, as well as to the social and material environment in which they are experienced. So same point as the socio-ecological theory, but now based on kind of, if you want, hard neurocognitive research of the brain. And the last theory is educational theory, and I'm glad you got in the feedback that for this conference not to forget that it's not only psychologists. I assume they're educationalists. So I think we cannot think well-being in schools without connecting or reconnecting this notion with the purposes of school. And Denmark has a perfect, this formal, how do you call it, the purpose of education, which is dannelse. or critical Dennis or Bildung, as we would say in English, in German English. But and this I build on the Frankfurt School and critical theory, but in the latest time, Gerd Bista is kind of further developing this theory, and he talks about 3 purposes of education: qualification, socialization, and subjectification. Qualification is learning, the grades, the PISA tests, whatever. Socialization, you know, adaptation to the social norms. But subjectification is the element which is the most neglected, and maybe neglected in your practices of PPR as well when you work with children, and this fixing the school and not fixing the children, because this is a process where, as he beautifully puts it there, Bista, pupils coming into the world, becoming subjects of action and responsibility in the face of unknown futures, and through the meeting with others different than themselves. So this is the key purpose of the school. It's not only to produce healthy children who are thriving, and thriving in a middle-class, white, Danish kind of way, but to create space for diversity, to create space for the becoming of the children, but of course consideration for the community and for the society as a whole. So to integrate all that together, and to finish with that, is this model of well-being that you can find in the paper in Danish if you want to read more. It's not to move where well-being is defined. Of course, it's an inner kind of process within the child, but it's closely in interaction with the outer dimensions, dynamics of the school environment. And here are some specific school environment. We define well-being in this paper as a state of being, belonging, becoming, and agency. We call it in English, this Handlecraft. And each of them is more closely connected with the specific dynamics of the school environment: the physical environment, the social environment, the diversity culture, the democracy, and co-determination. So the task for PPR, I would say, is not to move away from the individual child and towards the school, but to involve the child in meaningful ways, in even children with problems that you work with, in determining which factors, which dynamics in the school environment kind of co-produce their well-being or ill-being. What can be changed in these dynamics rather than only in the child? I'm not saying that you shouldn't work with the children, but here participation is a keyword, children involvement, and I know that you struggle with that, and all the school practices struggle with that. And by children meaningful involvement, I think in a more normative way, if you want, where it's not only to involve, to consult the child, but to allow the space where the child has actually possibility to have influence. So it's more in the line of the UN Convention of the Right of the Child. So is this at all possible in your practice? Join me in, at the beginning, Dorte said also in the feedback, it was this to use our fantasy. So to join me in this imaginative space from what is your realities, which I am very well aware of, and all the constraints and all the lack of time and resources and mandates and all that. But if you just for a moment think about what if you would modify your way of thinking about well-being in this direction, how would your practice look like? And I have 2 slides with some suggestions, but I'm not going to show them now, but I will leave it to you as a kind of a take-home messages. But I do hope that you will maybe have a look and come back in the panel discussion and we can talk about it. Thank you.